The arena lights flashed, cutting through the smoke and haze, painting a chaotic masterpiece of light and shadow. A heavy, distorted guitar riff ripped through the speakers, making the very floor vibrate. Then, a single, piercing spotlight hit the entrance ramp, and out he strode, the Viper. His real name was irrelevant. He was a brand, a force of nature, and the undisputed king of the WWE. He moved with a coiled, predatory grace, his eyes scanning the screaming crowd with a mixture of disdain and absolute self-satisfaction. Every step was a statement, every sneer a challenge. His entrance gear alone probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Custom-made, glistening with intricate designs, screaming money and power. He was young, impossibly talented, and completely undefeated. His rise had been meteoric, a blur of brutal matches and swift victories. From the moment he stepped foot in the squared circle, it was clear he was different. He didn't just win, he dominated. His in-ring style was aggressive, almost surgical. He'd pick apart opponents with a cold, calculating precision, his movements economical but devastating. He had a natural athleticism that few could match, combined with an innate understanding of how to control a crowd, even if that control often came from pure hatred. Fans either adored his ruthless efficiency or despised his arrogance. But no one could deny his skill. He was a champion in record time, leaving a trail of broken opponents and shattered aspirations in his wake. This success, however, had fed something dark within him. His natural confidence curdled into an almost pathological self-centeredness. He saw himself as above everyone else, opponents, fans, even the legends who came before him. He'd mock his defeated rivals, throw their signature moves back in their faces, and often address the audience with a condescending smirk. He'd grab a microphone after a brutal match, standing over a downed foe, and sneer, "You people paid good money to see this? You're all losers, just like him." His words were venom, his actions calculated to inflame. He reveled in the boos as much as the cheers, perhaps even more so. The more people hated him, the more powerful he felt. He was the bad guy, and he played the role to perfection. But there was a chilling authenticity to his disdain. It wasn't just an act. It was who he was. This polarizing persona made him a massive draw. People tuned in just to see if someone, anyone, could finally shut him up, to see if his reign of terror would ever end. He was the villain everyone loved to hate, the one who made you feel something, even if that something was pure, unadulterated rage. He sold out arenas, his merchandise flew off the shelves, and his name was always trending. The company loved him, despite his behavior, because he was a cash cow. He was a necessary evil, a lightning rod for attention, and he thrived on it. Sometimes, in rare moments of quiet contemplation, a flicker of something else would cross his face, a shadow, a fleeting memory. He rarely spoke of his past, but there were whispers, vague rumors of a troubled childhood, a missing father figure, perhaps a mentor who vanished or betrayed him. Whatever it was, it had carved an emotional scar deep within him, twisting his potential into this aggressive, almost cruel demeanor. It was a part of him he kept locked away, feeding his anger and his need to prove himself superior to everyone. He was driven by something more than just ambition. He was driven by a deep, unresolved pain, though he'd never admit it. His signature taunt was born from this arrogance. After every victory, sometimes even before the bell rang, he'd reach into his pockets, pull out a wad of crisp $100 bills, and toss them carelessly onto his opponent's chest. "Pin me," he'd sneer, his voice dripping with contempt, "and it's all yours." It was a public humiliation, a clear statement that he considered himself untouchable, that money meant nothing to him compared to his undefeated streak. No one had ever managed to pin him, and so the money always remained on the canvas, a symbol of his unchallenged dominance, before his entourage would sweep it away. It was a cruel, brilliant piece of showmanship that cemented his status as the most hated man in wrestling. He had ruled the WWE for what felt like an eternity, his championship reign unchallenged. Every challenger had fallen, crushed under his heel. He was at the peak of his power, a seemingly unstoppable force. The wrestling world revolved around him, waiting for the day someone would finally rise to meet his challenge, to put an end to his reign. But no one had. Not yet. The stage was set. The king was on his throne, and the world waited, unknowingly, for a storm that was brewing far away from the bright lights of the arena. The Viper moved through the city streets like a predator, sleek and self-assured. He was in Miami for a promotional event, a whirlwind of interviews and photo ops, but he insisted on walking a few blocks to his next appearance. It was a calculated move, a chance to be seen, to soak in the adoration and the envy. Flanked by two burly security guards, he cut a striking figure even in casual clothes, designer jeans, an expensive leather jacket, and sunglasses that hid his eyes, but couldn't hide the arrogant tilt of his chin. Fans swarmed him, thrusting phones forward, screaming his name. Paparazzi bulbs flashed, capturing every angle of the wrestling world's biggest star. He offered a practiced, almost bored smile, occasionally signing an autograph with a flourish. As he rounded a corner, the vibrant energy of the crowd seemed to thin, replaced by a grittier reality. The street here was less polished, the storefronts a little more worn. His eyes, though shielded by dark lenses, scanned the periphery with a casual dismissal. That's when he saw him. A man, disheveled, slumped against a brick wall, his clothes dirty, a tattered blanket pulled around his shoulders despite the warm Florida sun. He was just another face in the urban blur, seemingly invisible to the excited crowd that pushed past him, eager for a glimpse of the Viper. The Viper paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. It wasn't pity. It was more like a momentary curiosity, a brief acknowledgement of a life so far removed from his own. He watched the man for a beat, noting the vacant stare, the way his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a styrofoam cup. A thought, perhaps a cynical one, crossed the Viper's mind. This was a perfect opportunity to show off, to perform a small act of charity that would undoubtedly be caught by the cameras. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick roll of $100 bills, the kind of money most people only dreamed of seeing. With a motion that was both casual and undeniably theatrical, he peeled off a handful of bills, maybe 5 or 6, a good $500 or $600, and tossed them. They fluttered through the air, landing softly at the homeless man's feet, a stark contrast to the grime of the sidewalk. The crowd, still buzzing around the Viper, momentarily hushed. Then a few scattered laughs broke the silence. The Viper looked directly at the man, his voice cutting through the street noise, loud enough for those around him to hear. "Pin me," he said, his lips curling into that familiar, condescending smirk. "And it's yours." It was his catchphrase, twisted into a cruel joke, a public display of his boundless self-importance. He expected the man to scramble, to grovel for the money, to confirm his own superiority. But the homeless man didn't move right away. He didn't scramble. Instead, slowly, his head lifted. His eyes, cloudy and bloodshot, met the Viper's for a fleeting second. There was no desperation, No immediate grab for the cash. Instead, a subtle, almost imperceptible reaction crossed his face. It was a flicker of something, a spark that quickly vanished, replaced by the same distant, tired look. He just looked at the Viper, then at the money, then back at the Viper. It was a look that held a strange mix of recognition and something akin to quiet disappointment. The words, "Pin me, and it's yours," seemed to hang in the air between them, taking on a different weight in this context. The crowd chuckled, some people shaking their heads at the Viper's antics, others just finding it amusing. The security guards urged the Viper to keep moving, and he did, a satisfied smirk still playing on his lips. He walked away, surrounded by the clamor of his adoring public, completely oblivious to the real impact of his actions. To him, it was just another moment, another performance, another demonstration of his power and his contempt for those beneath him. The homeless man remained, still leaning against the wall, the crumpled $100 bills scattered at his feet. He didn't pick them up. His gaze, now steady and surprisingly sharp, followed the Viper until the wrestling star disappeared around the next corner, swallowed by the throng of fans and the city's ceaseless rhythm. The money lay there, untouched, a testament to something deeper than simple need. The man's expression was unreadable, a mixture of weariness and a newly ignited, almost forgotten fire. For a brief, fleeting moment, as the Viper walked away, a tiny seed of unease nudged at the edge of his consciousness. Something about the man's eyes, that almost recognition, felt off. It was like a forgotten echo from a distant past, a face he should know but couldn't place. He quickly dismissed it, though. Just another nameless face, another statistic. His mind was already moving on to the next interview, the next opportunity to bask in his own glory. He was the Viper, the undefeated champion, and no street vagrant was going to disturb his perfectly constructed world. But the image of those eyes and the unpicked money lingered for a moment longer than he would have liked. A faint, almost imperceptible ripple in his otherwise smooth, arrogant surface. The homeless man, whose name was David, watched the Viper disappear, the $100 bills still scattered on the dirty sidewalk around his worn shoes. His eyes, though tired, held a surprising depth, a history that no one on that busy street could have guessed. This was no ordinary homeless man. This was David, the Destroyer Miller, a name that once echoed through arenas, a man who once held the heavyweight championship belt with a grip of iron. Years ago, David was a force of nature in the wrestling world. He had a build that seemed carved from granite, a powerful physique that commanded respect the moment he stepped into the ring. His entrance was legendary, a slow, deliberate walk that radiated confidence and an unspoken promise of destruction. He wasn't flashy like the Viper. His strength and technique spoke for themselves. The crowds adored him, not just for his victories, but for his genuine demeanor outside the ring. He was a champion of the people, a man who believed in hard work and respect. Photos from his prime showed a man with a broad smile, surrounded by fans, his championship belts glinting under the arena lights. He was a hero, a legend in the making. But life, as it often does, had dealt David a cruel hand. His downfall wasn't a sudden crash, but a slow, agonizing slide. It started with a career-ending injury, a botched move during a championship match that tore through his knee and shoulder. The doctors told him he'd never wrestle again. For a man whose identity was so intertwined with his physical prowess, this news was devastating. The medical bills piled up, and without the income from wrestling, he quickly found himself in financial ruin. He tried to invest, to start new businesses, but without the same drive or knowledge, everything crumbled. Then came the betrayal. A trusted manager, someone David considered a friend, embezzled what little money he had left, leaving him with nothing. His family, unable to cope with his spiraling depression and financial woes, drifted away. He lost his home, his dignity, and eventually, his hope. David became a ghost, a forgotten hero living on the streets, his past glories buried under layers of dirt and despair. The wrestling world, always hungry for the next big thing, moved on without him. Younger fans had never heard of David the Destroyer Miller. He was just another face in the crowd, another invisible man. He had seen countless young, arrogant wrestlers rise and fall, but none had ever thrown cash at him with such open contempt, with that specific taunt. The Viper's words, "Pin me and it's yours," were like a jolt of electricity to David's dormant spirit. They resonated with a deep, almost primal part of him. That phrase, that challenge, was the core of wrestling. It wasn't just about money, it was about honor, about proving who was the better man. It stirred old memories, not just of his own triumphs, but of the code, the unspoken rules of the ring that the Viper seemed to mock so carelessly. For years, David had walked with his head down, accepting his fate. But that moment, that insult, ignited something within him. It was a spark of resolve, a flicker of the fighter he once was. As he watched the Viper disappear, David felt a shift. The weariness was still there, but beneath it, a new feeling began to stir. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was more like a quiet determination, a deep-seated need to answer that challenge. The money still lay untouched. He didn't need the money. He needed to reclaim a part of himself. He needed to prove that the spirit of the Destroyer was not entirely extinguished. There was also something else, a vague familiarity about the Viper. Not his face, which was too young, too cocky, but something in his movements, his stance, a certain aggressive confidence that felt known. David couldn't put his finger on it, but it was like looking at a distorted reflection of someone he once knew. Someone from a different life. It was a faint echo, a whisper from a past he had tried so hard to forget. He knew that stance, that particular brand of arrogant bravado. It reminded him of a young man he once trained, a promising rookie with fire in his belly and a thirst for greatness. That young man had a son, a boy who used to run around the training gym, mimicking the moves of the wrestlers. The connection was too faint, too distant, to be real, he thought, but the seed was planted. David, the forgotten champion, began to feel the stirrings of a purpose he hadn't felt in decades. He slowly bent down, not to pick up the money, but to tie the laces of his worn-out shoes, his gaze still fixed on the spot where the Viper had vanished. A plan, hazy and undefined, began to form in his mind. That street encounter, the one where the Viper tossed cash at the homeless man, didn't stay on that street for long. Someone in the crowd had pulled out their phone and recorded the whole thing. The video, grainy and a little shaky, started making the rounds online almost immediately. It showed the Viper, all flashy and full of himself, throwing money and saying his usual, "Pin me and it's yours." It then showed the homeless man, David, looking up with a strange mix of shock and something else, something unreadable, as the money fluttered to the ground. The internet, as it always does, exploded. The video went viral. People started talking. Some comments were full of anger, calling the Viper arrogant and disrespectful. They said he was everything wrong with pro wrestling today, a spoiled brat who had no respect for anyone. Others, though, defended him. They argued that it was just part of his character, that he was playing the villain perfectly. They loved how much he got under people's skin, saying it made wrestling exciting. The debate was fierce, splitting fans right down the middle. Everyone had an opinion on the Viper and his outrageous act. Meanwhile, David, the man at the center of the storm, was in a different world. The Viper's taunt, the challenge to pin me, had truly reawakened something deep inside him. It wasn't just the money or the public humiliation. It was the principle of it, the challenge itself. He started small, almost instinctively. When he was alone in some quiet corner of the park or a deserted alleyway, he would do stretches. Simple things at first, just trying to get the stiffness out of his joints. He'd push against walls, testing the strength in his arms, remembering the feel of his muscles coiling and uncoiling. His body was old and worn, but the muscle memory was still there, buried deep. He started doing push-ups, then squats, each movement a little painful, a little labored, but each one bringing back a tiny fraction of his former strength. He wasn't trying to become the destroyer overnight, but he was trying to shake off the rust, to feel alive again. As the viral video spread, something else started happening. Whispers began to circulate among the older wrestling fans, the ones who remembered the legends. They looked at the homeless man in the video, his face weathered but still familiar, and they saw glimpses of someone from the past. "Doesn't that guy look like David Miller?" Someone would post on a forum. "The Destroyer? No way, he disappeared years ago." Another would reply, but the comments kept coming. People started digging up old photos, comparing them to screenshots from the video. The resemblance was striking. The jawline, the intensity in the eyes, even the way he held himself, despite his current state. Rumors grew louder, speculation turning into a growing certainty that the homeless man was indeed David, the Destroyer Miller, a legendary figure long thought lost. The Viper, predictably, scoffed at all the online chatter. His manager showed him some of the comments, pointing out the growing buzz about the homeless man. "It's just internet noise," the Viper sneered, waving a dismissive hand. "Another publicity stunt. Let them talk. It only makes me more famous." He genuinely believed it was all part of the game, a way to keep his name in the headlines. He saw himself as untouchable, the best in the business, and no amount of online outrage or nostalgia for a forgotten champion was going to change that. He continued to train, but not with any special focus on this challenger. He was preparing for his next big pay-per-view match, not some charity bout against a bum. But the challenge, once issued so carelessly, found its way back to him. A persistent fan, an old-school wrestling enthusiast named Frank, had been following the story closely. Frank had grown up watching David Miller, and he recognized him instantly in the video. He also happened to know a minor promoter, a man who booked smaller, independent wrestling shows. Frank contacted the promoter, showed him the viral video, and then presented his crazy idea. A challenge. Not just any challenge, but a formal one, leveraging the Viper's own catchphrase. The promoter, seeing the potential for massive publicity, decided to run with it. He found a way to get the challenge to the Viper through official channels, framing it as a direct response to his public taunt. The Viper's reaction to the formal challenge was a mix of annoyance and amusement. His manager was against it. "It's beneath you, Viper," he argued. "Fighting some old homeless guy? It'll make you look bad." But the Viper's ego was too big to ignore it. He saw it as a perfect opportunity to shut everyone up, to prove his dominance, and to get even more attention. He pictured himself easily pinning the old man, throwing a few more bills, and then walking away, his reputation as the ultimate heel cemented. It would be an easy win, a publicity stunt that would only boost his appeal. To everyone's surprise, especially his managers, the Viper accepted the challenge. He announced it himself on social media, a short, cocky video where he grinned into the camera and said, "So, the old man wants to play. Fine. Pin me, and it's all yours." The wrestling world buzzed with disbelief and excitement. The stage was set for an unlikely and potentially humiliating showdown. The old man, no longer just a homeless figure, but David the Destroyer Miller, began his training not in a fancy gym, but in the quiet corners of the city. He found an abandoned lot behind a derelict warehouse, its cracked concrete serving as his canvas. Every morning, before the city truly woke, he was there. He started with simple stretches, his joints stiff and protesting, but with each passing day, the movements became smoother, less painful. He would do push-ups against a grimy wall, his back still strong, then pull-ups from a rusty pipe overhead, his muscles remembering their old routines. He ran, not long distances, but short, explosive sprints, mimicking the bursts of energy needed in a wrestling match. He practiced footwork, weaving and dodging imaginary opponents, his feet surprisingly light for a man his age. He wasn't aiming for perfection, just a fraction of his former glory, enough to prove a point. His diet was still meager, but a local soup kitchen, run by a kind woman who recognized him from his wrestling days, started giving him extra portions, a silent nod of encouragement. Slowly, steadily, the gauntness in his face began to recede, replaced by a lean, hardened look. His eyes, once clouded by despair, now held a sharp, focused intensity. One evening, as he was finishing his routine, a shadow fell over him. He turned to see an older man, his face etched with wrinkles, leaning on a cane. "David, is that really you? You old warhorse?" The voice was raspy but familiar. It was Charlie, his former trainer, a man who had practically lived in his corner during his championship reign. Charlie had fallen on hard times too, a series of bad investments and health issues, leaving him with little more than memories. But his mind was as sharp as ever, and he knew wrestling like the back of his hand. Charlie saw the fire in David's eyes, the determination that had once made him a champion. He offered his help, not for money, but for the sheer joy of seeing his old friend fight again. "You still got it in you, champ," Charlie said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just need to dust off the cobwebs." Charlie became David's shadow, his unofficial coach. He watched David's every move, correcting his form, pushing him harder, reminding him of old techniques. They discussed strategy, reliving past matches, dissecting opponents. Charlie even managed to scrounge up some old wrestling tapes, and they would watch them on a small, portable TV, analyzing holds, counters, and signature moves. David's body was responding, slowly but surely. The muscle memory was kicking in, his movements becoming more fluid, more powerful. He was regaining not just strength, but confidence. Meanwhile, the Viper was living in his own bubble of arrogance. He barely acknowledged the upcoming match with the old man. He saw it as a joke, a guaranteed win, a chance to further cement his image as the untouchable heel. His training sessions were still intense, but they lacked focus on this particular opponent. He spent more time posing for cameras, boasting on social media, and planning his next big entrance. He called David Grandpa in interviews, scoffing at the idea that an old, homeless man could ever pose a threat. He was young, strong, and at the peak of his career. What could a relic from a bygone era possibly do? He truly believed it would be a squash match, a quick, humiliating defeat for David Miller. One afternoon, as David and Charlie were reviewing some old footage, David paused the video on a specific frame. It showed a younger, more agile David Miller executing a complex submission hold. "That's the one," David murmured, a faraway look in his eyes. "The scorpion sting." Charlie nodded. "Your father's favorite. He taught it to you, didn't he?" David looked up, his eyes meeting Charlie's. "He taught it to me, and I taught it to someone else. Someone who needed a father figure after his own dad. Well, after his dad was gone too soon." Charlie stared at him, a sudden realization dawning. "Are you telling me?" David nodded slowly. "The Viper's father. He was just a kid, lost and angry. My best friend. I practically raised him. After his dad passed, taught him everything I knew about wrestling, including the scorpion sting." The revelation hung in the air. David wasn't just fighting for himself or for dignity. He was fighting for a legacy, for a connection that the Viper had long forgotten, or perhaps never even knew. He was fighting to teach a lesson to the son of a man he had loved like a brother. A lesson about respect, humility, and the true spirit of wrestling. This wasn't just a match, it was a reckoning. The news of the impending match exploded. The media, initially treating it as a bizarre sideshow, now saw the human interest story, the potential for a real-life Rocky tale. Old-school wrestling fans, who had dismissed the current generation as too flashy and lacking heart, were suddenly invested. Social media was ablaze with discussions, predictions, and even old clips of David the Destroyer Miller in his prime. The arena where the match was scheduled, usually reserved for mid-tier events, was selling out fast. Everyone wanted to see this unlikely showdown. The Viper, still oblivious to the true depth of his opponent's past, made a public appearance at a press conference. As he strutted onto the stage, flanked by bodyguards, he caught a glimpse of David Miller in the crowd, sitting quietly in the back. David was no longer the disheveled homeless man. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed, his gaze steady and intense. For a fleeting second, as David shifted his weight, the Viper saw something in his movements. A familiar economy of motion, a subtle readiness. It was a flicker, a ghost of a memory from his childhood, of watching his father train, of seeing a certain move executed with effortless grace. He dismissed it quickly, shaking his head. "Just an old man trying to relive his glory days," he muttered to himself. But the seed of doubt, planted weeks ago, had just received a tiny drop of water. The Viper, for the first time, felt a prickle of unease. The night of the match arrived, charged with an energy that even the most jaded wrestling veterans hadn't felt in years. The arena buzzed, a crucible of skepticism, anticipation, and a morbid curiosity that drew thousands. Every seat was filled, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and the roar of the crowd. This wasn't just another wrestling event. It felt like a moment in history. People whispered about the homeless man, about the Viper's arrogance, about the viral video that started it all. Everyone had an opinion, but no one truly knew what to expect. Then came the Viper's entrance. The lights dimmed, spotlights cut through the darkness, and a thunderous rock anthem blasted through the speakers. He emerged from the smoke, a figure of pure theatricality. His custom-made leather vest, studded and gleaming, caught the light. He walked with a swagger, a sneer plastered on his face, soaking in the mix of cheers and boos that washed over him. He paused at the top of the ramp, flexing for the cameras, his eyes scanning the crowd with an air of absolute self-importance. He truly believed this was his stage, and no old man was going to steal his thunder. He tossed a few crisp $100 bills into the front row, a final, arrogant flourish before stepping into the square circle. His overconfidence was palpable, almost a physical force in the arena. He bounced on the balls of his feet, ready to dispatch this relic of the past and solidify his reign. But then the atmosphere shifted. The rock anthem faded, replaced by a simple, almost melancholic blues riff. The lights softened, focusing on a single entrance ramp. There was no smoke, no pyrotechnics, just David Miller walking out. He wore simple black trunks, his body lean and conditioned, but showing the undeniable marks of age and hardship. His face was weathered, lines etched around his eyes, but they held a quiet determination, a deep resolve that radiated outwards. The crowd, initially hushed, began to stir. A smattering of applause started, then grew, swelling into a surprising wave of support. It wasn't the frenzied adoration the Viper received, but a deeper, more respectful recognition. David didn't swagger. He walked with purpose, his gaze fixed on the ring, a man on a mission. He stepped through the ropes, his movements economical, his eyes meeting the Viper's across the canvas. The contrast between the two men was stark, a vivid representation of old versus new, humility versus arrogance. The bell rang, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the tension. The match began, and just as many expected, the Viper dominated the initial exchange. He moved with a youthful agility, a whirlwind of strikes and quick grapples. He was faster, stronger in the moment, and his attacks were relentless. He used his speed to circle David, landing quick jabs, then retreating before the older man could counter. David absorbed the blows, his face stoic, his body responding slowly, methodically. He tried to lock up, to use his experience in close quarters, but the Viper slipped away, dancing around him, taunting him with a smirk. The crowd, which had started to lean towards David, began to murmur, some fearing that their hero was simply too old, that the Viper's youth and power would be insurmountable. The Viper seized David in a headlock, driving his knee into David's midsection, then threw him into the corner, following up with a hard splash. David slumped, momentarily winded. The Viper saw his opportunity. He dragged David to the center of the ring, preparing his signature finisher, a lightning-fast DDT that usually ended matches in seconds. He hooked David's head, ready to snap him down to the mat, a look of triumph already on his face. This was it, the easy win he'd predicted. But as he went for the final motion, David, with a sudden burst of strength, twisted out of the hold. He grabbed the Viper's arm, spun him around, and in one fluid, almost effortless motion, locked in a submission hold. It was quick, precise, and devastatingly effective. The Viper's arm was bent at an unnatural angle, his face contorted in a grimace of pain. It was the scorpion's sting. The crowd gasped. The Viper's eyes widened, not just from the pain, but from something else. The move, the way David had executed it, was eerily familiar. It wasn't just a submission hold. It was the submission hold. The one his father had shown him countless times in their backyard. The one he himself had learned years ago. A flood of childhood memories, unbidden and overwhelming, crashed over him. He saw his father, younger, laughing, demonstrating the move on a worn-out practice dummy. He saw another man, a strong, kind man with a gentle smile, helping his father, correcting his grip, showing him the nuances of the hold. That man's face, etched in his childhood memories, was David Miller's face. The Viper hesitated, his muscles tensing, but his mind reeling. The pain in his arm was real, But the confusion in his head was worse. He looked at David, his eyes searching, trying to reconcile the homeless man with the ghost from his past. David held the lock, his face impassive, his grip firm. He saw the flicker of recognition in the Viper's eyes, the moment of confusion, and knew his message was landing. He didn't tighten the hold further, but maintained it, letting the memory sink in. The Viper's arrogance, so absolute just moments before, began to crack. His usual quick reflexes were dulled by the sudden onslaught of memory and emotion. He struggled, but his movements were less about escaping the hold and more about processing the realization. This wasn't just an old man. This was him. The man who taught his father. The man who'd been a second father to him in those dark, confusing years after his own dad died. The man he had so cruelly dismissed. The Viper's hesitation, his momentary loss of focus, was all David needed. He released the scorpion's sting, but before the Viper could fully recover, David transitioned. He used his years of experience, his intimate knowledge of wrestling psychology, to capitalize on the Viper's distraction. He wasn't as fast, but he was smarter. He began to pick his spots, landing well-placed strikes, using holds that drained the Viper's energy and kept him off balance. The tide of the match began to turn, slowly but surely. The Viper, usually so composed and dominant, was now reacting, not dictating. He was fighting a ghost from his past, a mentor he had forgotten, and the weight of that realization was heavier than any physical blow. The crowd, sensing the shift, roared louder, their cheers now entirely for the older man, for the quiet determination that was slowly but surely overwhelming the young, arrogant champion. David Miller, the forgotten legend, was back. The match became a brutal dance, a grueling back and forth that pushed both men to their limits. David, despite his age, moved with a surprising fluidity, his strikes precise and economical. He wasn't relying on raw power, but on years of honed technique and an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the sport. Every move he made was designed to chip away at the Viper's youthful energy, to exploit his emotional turmoil. He used a series of arm drags and headlocks, classic moves that were simple but effective, each one a subtle reminder of the fundamentals the Viper had learned and perhaps forgotten. The Viper, for his part, fought back with a desperation, fueled by confusion and a dawning sense of shame. He was still fast, still strong, but his usual calculated aggression was replaced by a wild, almost erratic energy. He threw powerful clotheslines and drop kicks, but many missed their mark, or were expertly dodged by David. The crowd was on its feet, a wave of noise washing over the arena. They were witnessing something far more than a wrestling match. They were watching a reckoning. David, with a quiet intensity, began to incorporate more of the moves he had taught the Viper's father, the very techniques that had defined their training sessions decades ago. He executed a perfect snap suplex, a move that required both strength and timing, flawlessly. Then, he delivered a series of rapid fire chops to the Viper's chest, each one echoing through the arena, each one a physical manifestation of a forgotten lesson. The Viper recoiled, not just from the impact, but from the unsettling familiarity of the blows. He saw his father in David's movements, heard his father's voice in the rhythm of the match. Each strike, each hold, chipped away at the carefully constructed facade of arrogance the Viper had built around himself. He started to see David not as a homeless man, not as an opponent, but as a ghost from his past, a living embodiment of his deepest regret. A powerful knee lift from David sent the Viper stumbling back against the ropes. As he bounced off, David met him with a perfectly timed belly-to-belly suplex, slamming him to the mat with a resounding thud. The impact jolted the Viper, and suddenly, the floodgates of his memory burst open. He was no longer in the arena. He was a small boy again, sitting on the dusty floor of his father's makeshift gym, watching David and his dad spar. He saw David patiently explaining a hold, his kind eyes focused, his hands guiding his father's. He saw David laughing, a deep, booming laugh, as he playfully tossed the young Viper into the air. He remembered the smell of sweat and liniment, the sound of grunting and heavy breathing, the feeling of safety and belonging. He remembered David being there after his father died, a silent, comforting presence, teaching him how to tie his shoes, how to throw a baseball, how to be strong when he felt weak. David had been his rock, his connection to his father until the Viper, in his grief and confusion, had pushed everyone away. The images flashed through his mind like a supercut of his forgotten childhood. The moments David had been there, a constant, steady force, were undeniable. He saw David teaching him the very basics of wrestling, not as a sport, but as a way to channel his anger, to find discipline. He saw the kindness in David's eyes, the unwavering support, the gentle guidance, and then he saw himself, a teenager, full of misplaced rage and a desperate need to prove himself, pushing David away, rejecting his wisdom, his love. He remembered the last time he saw David, a heated argument, harsh words exchanged, and then David walking away, disappearing from his life. The Viper had told himself he didn't need anyone, that he was better off alone. He had built an empire on that lie. Now, lying on the canvas, winded and emotionally shattered, the Viper saw the truth. He saw the years of arrogance, the disdain he had shown, the cruel joke he had played on the very man who had once been a father figure to him. The cash he had thrown, the pin me and it's yours, taunt, echoed in his ears, now sounding like a grotesque mockery of everything David had ever stood for. His chest ached, not just from the physical blows, but from the crushing weight of his own self-betrayal. His carefully constructed persona, the one that had made him famous, felt hollow, cheap, and utterly pathetic. He looked up at David, who stood over him, not with triumph, but with a profound sadness in his eyes. David's gaze was steady, unwavering, filled with a mix of sorrow and understanding. He saw the breaking point in the Viper's eyes, the moment of raw, unvarnished realization. He knew his message had finally landed. He didn't need to inflict more pain. The emotional damage was already done. He moved with a practiced ease, grabbing the Viper's legs, twisting him onto his back. He dropped down, hooking the Viper's leg, and pressed his shoulders firmly to the mat. It wasn't a vicious pin, not a show of dominance. It was a precise, almost tender movement, a final lesson delivered with a heavy heart. The referee's hand slapped the mat once, 2, 3. The final count echoed through the arena, followed by a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The crowd erupted, a mixture of shock, elation, and a palpable sense of catharsis washing over them. They had witnessed the unthinkable. The undefeated Viper had been pinned, but the victory felt different, heavier than any other. The Viper lay there, defeated, his chest heaving. He wasn't just physically beaten, he was emotionally unraveling. The arrogance that had defined him for so long had crumbled, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. He looked at David, who slowly rose from the pin, his face etched with a quiet, sorrowful triumph. The Viper finally understood. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the pain of knowing he had dishonored the man who had given him so much. His humiliation was complete, but with it came a glimmer of true understanding, a dawning awareness of the depth of his actions and the profound impact they had. David extended a hand to the Viper, a simple gesture of compassion that instantly silenced the roaring crowd. The noise died down to a hushed murmur, everyone watching, holding their breath. The Viper, still sprawled on the canvas, looked at the offered hand. It wasn't a hand of pity. It was a hand of understanding, of shared history. He hesitated for a long moment, then slowly, almost reluctantly, took it. David pulled him up, not roughly, but with a firm, steady strength. They stood face to face in the center of the ring. 2 generations of wrestling, 2 very different paths, now intertwined. There was no need for words. In that shared moment, a silent, profound exchange passed between them. The Viper saw forgiveness in David's eyes, a deep well of it, despite everything. David saw regret in the Viper's, a raw honesty that had been absent for too long. It was a silent acknowledgement of the past, a quiet understanding of the present, and an unspoken hope for the future. The crowd watched, mesmerized, as the defeated champion and the victorious elder stood together, a tableau of unexpected reconciliation. Later, in the locker room, away from the flashing lights and the prying eyes of the crowd, the Viper sat alone, the belt he had once so proudly worn, now a meaningless prop. David found him there, sitting quietly. The Viper finally spoke, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual bravado. He publicly acknowledged his defeat, not just in the match, but in his life. He spoke of his arrogance, his misplaced pride, and the deep, cutting remorse he felt for his actions. He looked at David, his eyes clear for the first time in years, and expressed his respect, a genuine, heartfelt respect that resonated with the weight of their shared history. He apologized, not just for the public humiliation, but for the personal betrayal, for forgetting where he came from, for forgetting who he came from. For David, this was the true victory. The win in the ring was just a means to an end. His story, once relegated to dusty record books and fading memories, now resonated with millions. The video of the match, the unexpected twist, and the emotional aftermath went viral, sparking conversations about respect, second chances, and the true meaning of strength. Offers poured in, not for him to return to the ring as a fighter, but as a mentor, a coach, a guiding presence for young, ambitious wrestlers. He accepted some of them, carefully choosing roles where he could impart not just wrestling techniques, but the life lessons he had learned the hard way. He began a new chapter, his dignity restored, his wisdom valued. The streets were behind him, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. The Viper's path to redemption was longer, more arduous. The public defeat had shattered his carefully constructed image, but it had also, paradoxically, freed him. He took a break from the spotlight, retreating to reevaluate his life and his career. When he returned, his in-ring persona was different. The flashy entrances were toned down, the arrogant taunts replaced by a quiet intensity. He still had the skill, the power, but now it was tempered with humility. He started visiting wrestling schools, not to brag, but to share his story, to warn aspiring wrestlers about the pitfalls of unchecked ego. He became a more respectful figure, both inside and outside the ring, earning the genuine admiration of fans and peers alike. He even sought out David regularly, not just for wrestling advice, but for life advice, rebuilding the broken bond between them, forging a new, stronger connection based on mutual respect and affection. The story of the Viper and the homeless man, David, became a legend in the wrestling world. It was a tale whispered in locker rooms, discussed on podcasts, and replayed in highlight reels. It served as a powerful reminder that true strength isn't just about physical prowess, but about character, humility, and the willingness to learn. It showed that even the most arrogant can find redemption, and that hidden depths of human connection can surface in the most unexpected places. It became a testament to the idea that everyone has a story, and that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unlikely teachers. A new legacy was forged from that single, unexpected encounter. David, the forgotten champion, found his voice and his purpose once more, becoming a beacon of wisdom for a new generation. The Viper, once defined by his arrogance, transformed into a symbol of redemption and growth. Their lives, once so disparate, were forever intertwined, their story echoing through the annals of wrestling history, a powerful narrative of respect, humility, and the enduring power of human connection. The cash that had once been thrown in disdain was now a symbol of the immense value found in acknowledging the past, learning from mistakes, and building a better future together.